Well, this morning we welcome in our Sioux campus, our online campus. We welcome in our TV audience, radio audience, groups who are watching us that meet together in Charlevoix and Harbor Springs and Bois Blanc Island and down at the Tall Timber Church in Florida. We are so glad to have you tuning in, no matter where you're at, what venue, what campus, what method you're using. It's good to have you with us this morning. Well, I invite you this morning to take your Bible and open them to Psalm 46. If you're using a device, power up, please, to Psalm 46. And we continue our series, Pausing in Psalms. And today we're going to talk about how do I respond when I feel miserable? How do I respond when I feel like I'm in misery? Tomorrow is the anniversary of 9/11, and if you remember, it was 3 days after 9/11. It would have been Friday that year, September 14th. President Bush called for a national day of remembrance and prayer, and there was a special prayer service held at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And even though no airplanes were allowed to be flying yet at that time, they did send a plane to North Carolina, where they summoned the Reverend Billy Graham and brought him to Washington, D.C. to address the nation in that special prayer service. This past week, I went back and I watched that message that Billy Graham gave that day. I encourage you to do the same. But Billy Graham, on that day, 3 days after the tragedy took place, read from this very psalm these words. Psalm 46, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And the theme of Billy Graham's message that day was simply, we need God. God is our refuge. God is our strength. God is a very present help in time of trouble. What I would like to do before we unpack this psalm is I'd like to give you a little bit of history behind it and talk about its structure. Because I believe you must understand the structure of the psalm to really allow the psalm to impact your life. But first, the history. We know that this psalm, though we don't know who wrote it, was written during a time of trouble. That's why verse 1 begins, God is our refuge, our strength, a very present help in trouble. I think it's quite possible that the scenario behind this psalm happened in 701 BC, when King Sennacherib, leader of the Assyrian Empire, led his mighty military engine on a deadly rampage through the Middle East. They had already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, and they were on their way to their target, Egypt. And they were wiping out anything in the way. And standing in the way was the little kingdom of Judah. King Hezekiah at that time was the king, one of the few godly kings of that era, a king who had led Judah in a revival spiritually. And as Sennacherib and the Assyrian Empire surrounded the city of Jerusalem, they sent word to Hezekiah saying, you have two options: surrender and all become our slaves, or die. If you want to read what transpires in that event, you can do so later on by reading 2 Kings chapter 18, 19, and 20. But I believe it is very possible that it was during that sequence that Psalm 46 is written. God is our refuge, our strength, a very present help in trouble. We need God. Now, the structure of this psalm is vital to understand, because what the psalmist will do is to say this: because these three truths are there, In your time of trouble, God is your refuge, your strength, your very present help. Because that's true, there are three results. In your time of trouble, you do not need to fear, you should not be shaken, and you don't have to live in a state of inner angst and strife. You can cease striving. And in order to get us from the three truths about God to those three results in our lives, he paints for us three scenarios. Three scenarios of trouble. The first scenario will deal with what we might call natural disasters. And he will say, when natural disasters occur, you do not need to fear. Why? Because God is your refuge, your strength, and your very present help. The second scenario will deal with international disruptions. And he will say, when international disruptions take place, you do not need to be shaken. Why? Because God is your refuge, God is your strength, and God is your very present help. And then the third scenario will deal with personal distress. And he will say, when there are times of personal distress in your life, you do not need to live in a state of inner strife. Why? Because God is your refuge, God is your strength, and God is your very present help. But then he does something important. Something that we tend today to just skip right over. He adds a word. And he adds the word not once, not twice, but three times. And the word that he adds is the word Selah. And when we read the Psalms and we see the word Selah, typically we just glance right over it, almost as if it is insignificant. But I would suggest to you that the only way this psalm can really impact your life is if you understand the word. It's used three times in this psalm. At the end of verse 4, Selah. At the end of verse 7, Selah. At the end of verse 11, Selah. In fact, this word is so important that it's used 71 times in the book of Psalms. 71 different times you'll see the word Selah. Now there's only one other book in the Old Testament that uses the word. Now there's 38 other books. Only one of them used the word besides the book of Psalms. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to turn to someone near you and take a guess. You've got a 1 in 38 chance of getting it right. What other book of the Old Testament? Go ahead, just take a shot at it. You say, I don't know any other books. Make one up. The person next to you probably doesn't know them either, okay? But give it a whirl. What do you think it is? Outside the book of Psalms, what's the only other book in the Old Testament that uses the word Selah? Now, if you said Habakkuk, you got it right. If you said Habakkuk, you're a very lucky guesser and should go buy a lottery ticket after the service, okay? This word Selah is used 3 times in the book of Habakkuk. So it's used 74 times in the Old Testament, 71 of which are in the book of Psalms, 3 of which are in the 11 verses that make up Psalm 46. It's actually a musical notation. And that's because this psalm, as is the case with many others, it was written to be sung. It's a musical notation, and the musical notation literally means pause. That's what it means. Pause. Every good musician, every good composer, every good public speaker knows the power of a well-timed pause. But it's not just pause for the sake of pausing. The word carries the idea of pause and ponder. In other words, don't just keep reading. Don't just keep listening. Hit the stop button. Hit the pause button. Put on the brakes. Just think about it. Or to use a more modern vernacular, let what you've just heard or read sink in. And folks, Psalm 46 will never impact your life if all you do is read it and move on to Psalm 47. The power of Psalm 46, listen, is in the Selah. It's in the moments that we pause, we stop, we think, we ponder, we let it sink in. Now, with that as a backdrop, I think you'll better understand Psalm 46. So let's unpack it. It begins in verse 1 by telling us three truths about God. God, number one, is our refuge. In other words, in times of trouble, God is our protection. Now notice, it does not say that God points us to protection. It says that God himself is our protection. In times of trouble, God himself is your protection. Selah. Just pause. Just let that sink in. God is our refuge, but he's also our strength. So he's not only our protection, he is our power. He's our source of power. He doesn't point us to a source of power. God himself, in times of trouble, he is your source of power. Selah. Just let that sink in for a moment. God is our refuge. God is our strength. And God is our help, our provision. He doesn't just point us to help. God himself is our help. And I love the way it's worded. In time of trouble, listen, God isn't just your help. He's your present help. He's not just your present help. What is he? Your very present help. Selah. Pause. Ponder. Just let that sink in. If I had to summarize Psalm 46, especially verse 1, I would summarize it with this phrase: God is present in our trouble. God is present in our trouble. Just hit the pause button. Just think about that. Just let that truth sink in. Your God is present in your trouble. Now that word trouble is a Hebrew word that means to be restricted, to be tied up, to be in a cramped place. If we wanted to use a more modern vernacular, it would be this. The word trouble means to find yourself between a rock and a what? A hard place. Trouble is when you find yourself between a rock and a hard place where there is no noticeable way out and things seem to be getting worse instead of better. That's what the word trouble means. When you find yourself between a rock and a hard place, and you can see no noticeable way out, and things seem to be getting worse instead of better, there's something I can guarantee you. I can guarantee you that in your life, you will experience trouble. In fact, I think I can prove that. How many of you, no matter where you're listening at right now, if you're online, you can use the like button. In person, you can raise your hand. How many of you have had a time in your life that you can remember? A time that you found yourself between a rock and a hard place. A time when you saw no noticeable way out and it seemed like things were getting worse instead of better. How many of you have experienced that? Yeah, exactly. Let me ask you another question. How many of you are pretty certain that before you die, you will probably experience trouble again? Raise your hand. And if your hand's not up, I don't know what to do with you. I really don't. There's something I can guarantee you. In this life, there will be trouble. You will find yourself at times between a rock and a hard place where there's no noticeable way out and it seems like things are getting worse instead of better. I guarantee it. But I can guarantee one other thing. When that time of trouble comes, when you are between the rock and the hard place and you see no noticeable way out and it seems like things are getting worse instead of better, I can guarantee you this: you will not walk through that trouble alone. Why? Because in your time of trouble, your God is your refuge. Your God is your strength. Your God will be your very present help. Selah. Just pause. Just let that sink in. Just let that flow over your spirit. You see, without the Selah, Psalm 46 doesn't have the impact. So, what the psalmist does now is he gives those three illustrations. 3 examples of trouble. Now, let me summarize each of those, and then we'll go back and read them in detail. The first one he gives in verses 2 and 3 deals with the trouble of natural disasters. And basically, here's what the psalm says. I'm going to summarize it. He says this: when nature is in upheaval, I will not fear. Why? Because God is my refuge, my strength, and my very present help in trouble. And then he says, Selah. Just hit the pause button. Just let that sink in. In verses 4 through 7, he gives the example of international disturbance. And if I could summarize it, here's what he says. When Jerusalem is under attack, I will not be moved. I will not be shaken. I will not doubt in my faith, because God is my refuge. God is my strength. God is my very present help in trouble. And then he adds, Selah. Think about that. Take time to ponder it. Let that truth sink in. And then in verses 8 through 11, he gives the third scenario. That one would deal with personal distress. And if I could summarize it, here's what he says. When I am standing in the battlefield after a war, I will not strive. I will cease striving. Why? Because God is my refuge. God is my strength. God is my very present help in trouble. And then he adds the words, say it with me, Selah. What a beautiful word. Just pause. Just let that truth sink in. Without the Selah, Psalm 46 loses its punch. Well, let's break it down. Let me read verses 2 and 3. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. And then he says, Selah. What's the pattern? He says, well, the trouble is nature being in upheaval. My response to that is, I will not fear. Why? Because God is my refuge. God is my strength. God is my very present help. Selah. Pause. Just think about it. Don't just race on. Think about it. The reality of the trouble was nature being in upheaval. The earth changing, the mountains slipping into the sea, the waters roaring and foaming, the mountains quaking. And what was the response? I will not fear. Why? Because my God is with me in my trouble. My God in my trouble is my refuge. My God in my trouble is my strength. And my God in my trouble is my very present help. And he adds, what word? Selah. Just think about that. Take time to process it. Let it become part of who you are. Let it transfer from your ears to your mind to your heart. And then we see verses 4 through 7. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she will not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations made an uproar, the kingdoms tottered, but God raised his voice and the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Selah. So what's the pattern here? The trouble is Jerusalem is under attack. My response, I will not be moved. Why? Because God is my refuge, my strength, and my very present help. Selah. Just let it sink in. By the way, when it says, I will not be moved, that's a word that literally means to totter, to shake. In modern vernacular, you could say, I will not get shook up. I won't get shook up about all the trouble in my life. Why? Now here's the key. Listen. What keeps the psalmist from getting all shook up about the trouble in his life? It's not the fact that the trouble disappears. It's the fact that his God, who is his refuge, his strength, and his help, is present in his trouble. You see that. You see it in verse number 5, that God is in the midst of her. You see it in verse 7, that God is with us. The whole theme to Psalm 46 is that God is present in our trouble. Selah. Just let that sink in. And then we see verses 8 through 11. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. He, God, makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He, God, breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He, God, burns the chariots with fire. Because that is true, cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. And now we see it again, the theme to the chapter. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Selah. So it's the scenario here. Standing in a battlefield after a war. What's the response? I will not live in inner angst. I will not live in inner strife. I will cease striving. Why? Because I know that the God who is my refuge, the God who is my strength, the God who is my help is with me. Selah. Just think about it. The verse there says, cease striving and know that I am God. Cease striving. It's a very beautiful word in the Hebrew language. It's a word that means to relax. You could say to rest. It's a word that means to do nothing. Be quiet. Don't sweat it. Or to use modern vernacular, just chill out a little bit. Just chill. I wonder how many times God just wants to speak to us and say, just chill out a little bit. You're over the top right now. It's a word that described the end of a workday. Cease striving meant you put your tools down. You could now go home and rest. Relax. Be quiet. What a beautiful word. And according to the psalmist, that can and should be our response in times of trouble. Why? Because God is our refuge. God is our strength. And God is our very present help. And that God who is our refuge, our strength, our very present help that we've already learned is with us in our trouble, this verse teaches he's not just with us, he's in control. Selah. Think about that. He's not just with you in your trouble. Listen, he's still in control. Even though you see no noticeable way out, he's in control. Even though things seem to be getting worse instead of better, he's in control. He is the one who wrought desolations. He is the one that made wars to cease. He's the one that breaks the bow. He's the one that cuts the spear in two. He's the one that burns the chariot with fire. He's in control. It reminds me of a verse in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 31 says this: the horse is prepared for the day of battle. In other words, you better get your horse ready. There's things you need to do, no doubt. But the victory belongs to the Lord. It's what we saw last Sunday when we talked about how to respond when you feel mistreated. You control what you can control. Get your horse ready for battle. But you leave what you can't control to God. The battle belongs to the Lord. And then he says, Selah. Just pause. Just tap the brakes a little bit here. Just take a moment and let that sink in. The thing I love about Psalm 46 is this. Psalm 46 has no expiration date. It doesn't begin by telling you this psalm is best if it's used by a certain day. The truths in this psalm that allowed Judah to not fear, not be moved, and cease striving when Sennacherib had surrounded the city, they're still true today. The truths of this psalm that were real and true when Billy Graham spoke these words 3 days after 9/11, these exact truths are true for your trouble today. Selah. Just pause. Just let that sink in. So let me ask you a few questions this morning. Question number one. Does it feel like your world is crumbling around you? Or maybe a part of your world is crumbling around you? And you see no noticeable escape route? It seems that every morning when you wake up, it's gotten worse, not better. Don't fear, because your God is your refuge. Your God is your strength. Your God is your very present help in your time of trouble. Selah. Just stop right there. Just let that cover your thinking. Just let that cover your feelings. Question number 2. Does it feel like your home is crumbling around you? And you see no noticeable way out. And it seems like every week it just gets worse and not better. Don't be shaken. Don't be moved. Your God is your refuge. Your God is your strength. Your God is your very present help in your trouble. Selah. Just stop. Just quiet. Just hush. Let those words penetrate. Question 3. Does it feel like you are fighting a battle that you simply cannot win? Some of you feel that way today. You feel like you're fighting a battle that's beyond your ability to win. You see no noticeable way out. And it seems like it's getting worse and not better. Cease striving. Because your God in the midst of your battle is your refuge. Your God is with you in the midst of your battle, and he is your strength. Your God is with you in the midst of your battle, and he is your very present help. Say the word with me. Selah. Just stop. Just think about that. Don't rush on. So if I was going to paraphrase or really wrap up this psalm, it would simply say this: when you're going through trouble, you do not have to fear. You do not have to be shaken. You do not have to live in inner angst and striving. Why? Because the Lord is your refuge. The Lord is your strength. And the Lord is your very present help. Selah. I want to challenge you. View the troubles of your life through the lens of Psalm 46. Just pause. Let those truths wax over you. But go further than that. When you see the current events of our time in the news, and you see things that are communicated on social media, view the news today. View what you read on social media through the lens of Psalm 46. Some of you need to chill out. Some of you need to relax a little bit. Some of you are living in a state of fear because of what you read and hear and see. Some of you are shaken. Some of you are living your life in angst and strife. What a miserable way to live. And what makes it even worse is you don't have to live that way. Because God is your refuge. God is your strength. God is your very present help in trouble. Selah. Just pause. Can I add one more? At the risk of being stoned, if you haven't noticed yet, we've now entered full throttle another presidential election cycle. If you haven't noticed that yet, God bless you. But folks, can I just give you some preventive medicine here? The next year and a half is going to be filled with trouble. And every message that is communicated is going to have one goal: to cause you to fear. Because you see, that's the way elections are won today. Elections are no longer won based on issues. Both sides of the aisle, doesn't matter. One's not guilty, the other innocent. They're all guilty. Today we win elections with this strategy: I need to get you as scared as possible about what it will be like if the other person wins. You're going to hear that a lot. And you're going to see a lot of overzealous Christians do the same thing. Just being honest. Can I just encourage you as you go into this cycle? View everything about politics over the next year and a half through the lens of Psalm 46. No matter what you hear, no matter what you read, no matter who ultimately wins the election, how long it takes to decide if they really won, and what kind of controversy there is as if they really won, no matter how it turns out, this I can guarantee you: God will be your refuge. God will be your strength. God will be your very present help. You do not need to fear. You do not need to be shaken. You do not need to live in angst and strife. Say it with me: Selah. Just think about that. Would you pause with me, please, for prayer? And would you stand as we stand together? Father, I confess, as I'm sure most would in this room, that we need to practice the spiritual discipline of Selah more often. Because our life is filled with troubles. And we, on a almost daily basis, find ourselves in situations or hearing about news or reading things that make us feel like we're between a rock and a hard place with no noticeable way out. And things just seem to be getting worse instead of better. And unfortunately for many of us, the result of that is that fear develops. We're shaken in our faith. We live a life of inner angst and inner strife. And the sad part is, we don't have to live that way. So help us, Father, to view life, to view current events, to view politics through Psalm 46. Christ alone is my refuge. Christ alone is my strength. Christ alone is my very present help. I will not fear. I will not be shaken. I will cease striving in Christ alone. So as we worship you with this beautiful modern hymn, I pray, God, that we won't just sing it, but we'll sing it with a mindset of Selah. We'll sing it and ponder the words. We'll let the words wash over our spirit and bring us peace. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.